to share my screen here with you because I did prepare a PowerPoint, which I thought might be useful in terms of um, of making sure that when we do look at the pandemic and we look at the responses that we will have as a global community to it, we approach it from a systemic way, because we, as I think, as Anna and Ollie have pointed out, there are so many interlinkages with all of them. Let me start by some examples of what we are seeing in terms of the environmental impact of COVID-19 in some of the countries in the developing world. I think, as Anna and Jean-Marc have pointed out, we have improved air quality. There are pictures and stories about, for the first time from New Delhi, you can actually see the Himalayas already after 40 years. You've got smog going down in Beijing and all that kind of thing. But as Jean-Marc was pointing out, it's actually very temporary. It's only for this period because nobody's traveling. Factories are shut down in many countries, and that comes at a big human cost as well, because many poor people are being hit by the fact that you're not actually doing any economic activity. What we're also seeing in many developing countries, especially those where you have municipal systems where waste management is not very well done, either because they're open landfills or they just do open burning. There are increasing difficulties in how you do manage the plastic waste. I've seen stories, for example, in some countries where they have pointed out that you're now seeing in many beaches and parks or walking trails, discarded single-use surgical masks, single-use gloves, things like those. And I think that is going to be, as the pandemic goes on, that's going to be a bigger part in terms of how one looks at it from a developing country perspective. For many developing countries where you have a lot of reliance, for example, on ecotourism, or where you have significant stretches of their territory which are being protected as natural parks, we are seeing increases in poaching, increases in deforestation, largely because either tourism receipts have gone down, and therefore you don't have enough, the government doesn't have enough money anymore to pay for the rangers and all that would protect the wild animals from poaching, or prevent illegal loggers from going in. And that is now happening, for example, in Indonesia, in the Amazon, in DRC. One of those things that we often do not see because it's a bit far also is that while the pandemic and the lockdown that has resulted in small-scale fishers and commercial fishers to remain in port have allowed fish stocks to happen, again, like many of these other the positive environmental impacts that we have seen during the pandemic, it has come at a big human loss as well, because income for many of these small-scale fishers, for example, have gone down. So what I think, as a couple of, as both Anna and Ollie pointed out, what we have seen is that the health crisis has become an economic and financial crisis, especially in developing countries where you already have a lot of structural challenges that are in place already, which have kept many developing countries in a state of poverty for a large part of their population. So you have impacts of climate change, you have impacts of environmental crisis, you have, and all of these have resulted in a situation where, as with climate change, as with biodiversity loss, the developing countries are the ones that are being hit hardest economically. And what we have seen now is that there are increases in poverty and inequality both within countries, and we are seeing that even here in Europe and in the United States, but also among countries where you see the fact that countries that have well-built infrastructure, that have the ability to provide fiscal stimulus, are still in a relatively better position than countries that do not have these things. So I think Anna was pointing us towards the idea that when we look at the post-pandemic response, and we look at all of the linkages that we have all together, the post-pandemic response has to be systemic and it has to be structural. So it means it has to be transformative, it's not incremental, and what we're looking for is something that is a multi-dimensional approach where resilience is being built to address all of these things together, not only the pandemic, but also climate change, poverty, environmental crisis, and all of these things. And that means, I think I'm drawing a bit here from what Ollie was saying. That means I think we have to really think about what are the regulatory frameworks that we are putting in place, whether it's on trade, whether it's on investment or on finance, what kind of new incentives or bans or prohibitions do we need to put in place to shift away from the pre-pandemic business as usual to a post-pandemic new normal. And that might include, for example, looking at how we reshape macroeconomic policy, how we reshape social security policies, how we reshape the fiscal stimulus that should go towards creating the economies and rebuilding the economies so that you are able to gear them towards better resilience, better sustainability, and better development equity. A key part of that systemic response that I think many of us are now thinking about, and which I think is quite clear, is that you do have to have this strengthened multilateralism. And we know that this kind of approach is difficult now with the kind of approaches that we see some of the major powers taking place. But that is the essence, that is the essential thing that really needs to happen: international cooperation and coordination. And when you therefore you do this pandemic response measures for the short term, it has to be with the idea of looking at, okay, how do we make sure that these short-term responses build us towards a longer-term response that is much more systemic, much more structural, and much more integrated in a way, where you are able to address all of these things that I have listed down in this slide. Just to close, I think it would be useful for us to take a read at what more than 10 years ago, 11 years ago, actually, at the start of another crisis, when the United Nations had this World Conference on the Global Financial Crisis in 2008, the UN General Assembly at that time, the late Father Miguel Descoto of Nicaragua, said something that was quite important for us to read. He was saying that when we take decisions, it must be that affect us collectively. It must be for the common good. That we have to acknowledge that things as they were in the past have been the result of lifestyles, of consumptions, of relationships, both with our economies and with nature, that have in effect brought us beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, and created a profound social imbalance. And so what we need to do is not do incremental changes, not try to bring us back to the pre-pandemic normal, but replace that with a new normal that is built on solidarity, that involves change in a systemic way, so that when we are able to do, as he was putting here, a qualitative leap forward towards peace and well-being. So maybe let me end there, Jean-Marc, and I'd be very happy to take questions. Thank you.